and friends, and you are my friends, and Jim's friends, and we're all friends here on Jim Cornette's Drive-Thru.
Your friends, my friends, we're all friends. Everybody's a friend of mine.
Everybody. Well, I can think of a few people that may.
And you can call me Al.
You like that song? Do you like Paul Simon's later work?
Well, his later work, like he's fucking Rembrandt in the Renaissance period. Yeah, Paul Simon's very well. You know, he stood next to Art Garfunkel all those years, so he looks good by comparison. Art Garfunkel had a good voice, had a mellifluous voice, very melodic, and he was a very excellent singer. Was Art Garfunkel, but that Jufro was just Jesus.
Well, I could tell you because I've done business with a lot of people. I don't know why, but I've done business with a lot of people who have done business with Art Garfunkel. And first, I could tell you. I know it was one thing back in the 60s, maybe even at Central Park in 1980, but his Jufro now is a wig. He actually has like a little wig.
No.
That mimics the
he has recreated the Jufro
yes.
in synthetics, yes. Is what you're telling me.
That's exactly what I'm telling you.
Well, that's see now, it's almost like a Milli Vanilli incident is what it is, where you're claiming to present Art Garfunkel in his entirety, but instead there's pieces of him that's synthetic.
Yes, and if you thought of one member of the group having a wig, it may not have been Art Garfunkel.
That wouldn't have been my first pick of the two of them would not have been Art Garfunkel wearing the wig. Synthetic is a good word. That Jackie Fargo used that word in his famous promo when he was introducing the Fabulous Ones, when he talked about Jimmy Hart and his New York Dolls, where Troy Graham, the Dream Machine, and Quick Draw Rick McGraw was wearing top hats and tuxedo tails, carrying canes like the Fabulous Fargos. They didn't have the passion and the heart and the guts and the courage of the Fabulous Fargos. Jimmy Hart's New York Dolls were so synthetic, and he said synthetic with such disdain, and he practically spit the word out of his mouth like that was he just called Jimmy Hart a motherfucking cocksucker on television, but instead he said synthetic. And you could almost see his lips turn brown from the filth of that word as he spewed it out.
There's another word that he says much more angrily in that same promo, and that's the word stink.
You stink.
You stink. You stink. You stink. You stink.
He used it as a noun and a verb and an adjective.
Yes.
Because it was almost like your stinking stinks, pal. It was almost that in that same promo. He used it as variety, but you stink. You stink.
Another interesting Art Garfunkel fact. So he has an apartment in New York City, and he also has a hotel room, or at least he did as of a few years ago, across the street in a hotel that he always keeps. So if he doesn't want to be home, he goes across the street into a hotel. I don't know if it's the same floor as his apartment.
So he can technically look across the street and see either his room or his apartment.
Yes, correct.
Wherever he's at.
And in this apartment, he apparently has...
Why do you know so much about Art Garfunkel's private, secretive affairs?
I can't tell you. When I said I know a lot of people have done business with him...
But you can't reveal these sources.
I can't reveal them, but I could say that every one of them comes out of every meeting with him and says, I gotta tell you about the latest Art Garfunkel thing. It's
okay, well, what's he got in his apartment then? You say in his apartment.
He has a considerable library, and that's something I love because it's something I have at home. He has apparently a massive book collection, but every book is in a plastic bag. And one day, a colleague of mine was up there for a meeting, and he said, Art, and I think Art was in a bathrobe, and he said, Art, I'm wondering, why are all the books in plastic bags? And Art looked at him and raised one finger and said, I own every book I've ever read. Which answers nothing.
What?
So the mystery continues. Why does he wrap his books in plastic bags?
I own every book I've ever read.
This is a bang drive-through so far.
Actually, I think me and Art probably get along from the sound of him. I think we'd be kindred spirits in a lot of ways.
He's tall. He's about your height, probably.
So you think I'm tall? I'm a tall man now?
You know, when I first met you, I thought you were taller than I thought you were going to be.
Well, it's because I guess, and I have an inferiority. How did I say that? Let me try that again. Take two. I have an inferiority complex about my size, and I'm not talking about in a penile fashion. I've just never thought that I was as big a human being as I am, because for my entire, not only adult life, but a lot of my teenage years, I was surrounded by preternaturally large individuals, very oversized folks above the norm. And so, but when I get around normal people, civilians, as it were, not involved in the wrestling industry, then I tend to be as large, or in some cases larger than those folks. And so maybe it's just it's a state of mind I've had about the whole thing. It's good to hear you call me tall, like I'm statuesque or something.
I just watched some Bobby Heenan footage recently, and I remember thinking, he's taller than I remembered him being. He was about the same height as Bockwinkel. And, they always say that you want your managers to be short. You don't want them to be bigger than the wrestlers. Who's the tallest manager you ever saw actually work as a manager?
Oh my God! Bearcat Wright was just
true. Yeah.
Was just the ludicrousness, most ludicrous or ludicrousness example of a manager that almost had to be bigger than anybody he managed. But he had been a main event wrestler for all those years, and then he had heart problems. He had to back out of the ring, but he was 6'7" and 275, and a former champion wrestler and pro boxer. So it's not like, that completely violated that rule. But as far as Slick was not a short man or a small man.
Because you never want your manager to be too tall. And then he goes, let me tell you something, Bob Backlund, I have a new charge. He's coming into the territory. He's going to destroy you. Here he is. And then you point to like Taz. Like, you don't want that. You want the manager to be able to point up and say, this is the man who's coming to get you.
Well, but Slick was able to convey that he was not he was a preacher, not a fighter. But a lot of times, like with Yokozuna, he was maybe like 6'1" or 6'2". I mean, we were close to the same height. So I would stand, either they would have an interview box for him, on pre-tape, so he'd look even bigger. Or if you notice, even in the ring, a lot of times when I'm next to him, I was standing with my legs kind of spread out. I do it on interviews where they're shooting us up from the waist. I had great thighs in the WWF days because I was standing with my legs 4 feet fucking apart. It was goddamn looked like a gymnastics act. The below the waist we were doing our promos. But or always look up or put your hand up on the guy's shoulder and kind of crouch down like you're next to him, just make him bigger. But It is when I was with my first tag team was Danny Davis and Ken Wayne, the Galaxians, later to become the Nightmares. And Dan, I just saw Danny this weekend. Obviously, we later to become more successful as partners with OVW, but they were both 5'7" So that was I felt like, hey, but that was my training for being on the modern day wrestling rosters with Ring of Honor or some of these modern day promotions. When I'm doing the interviews and conducting the interviews, and I have to bring in the world champion and look down and say, "How are you, little buddy?" It's like I feel like a big bully anymore.
Yeah, I guess it's much worse to have a commentator who's taller than all the wrestlers, because Polish Joe Chupik, who worked for Mike Shields in the AWA, told me that was the problem with Larry Nelson. Larry Nelson, I think, was like 6'4". So,
remember Craig Johnson?
How tall is Craig Johnson?
Pedicino? Craig Johnson had to be 6'5". As a matter, that was Scotty the Body, Raven. He was Scotty the Body. They had the greatest line I've ever heard on a wrestling program when he came in and said, "You're the biggest Johnson I've ever seen." Yeah, he was ginormous.
Well, Larry Nelson would have to stand either, with his legs bent or crouched down while he was interviewing everyone because he was the tallest guy on the roster.
Maybe that's why he was always orgasming like he was in the promos, because finally the pain in his legs somehow, tripped him. I don't know.
All his reactions are due to leg cramps.
Yeah. Oh, my leg. Oh, please rub it. Please rub it. Please rub it. Oh.
Well, you're on Cornette's Drive-Thru. We have questions from the listeners. And this is becoming a regular thing. We just begin the show talking about whatever we want to talk about.
Well, we don't really plan.
No.
We don't, it just unfolds that way. And
well, let's see how
there you have it.
Let's see how the rest of this unfolds.